In this video, we're going to have a look at the basics of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So aggregate demand and aggregate supply we use to look at the areas of macroeconomics. So looking at the whole economy and looking at the big macroeconomic ideas of economic growth, employment, and inflation in particular. So the first thing to remember or to be aware of is aggregate demand is made up of four key areas. Consumption expenditure, that's us consumers and what we spend our money on. Investment expenditure, so that's businesses and their spending. Government spending, and what we call net exports, which is export earnings take away import spending. So we have a formula we use for aggregate demand, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Get used to it, you need to know it off by heart. C is pretty self-explanatory, isn't it? C for consumption spending, remember that is consumers. I for investment spending, so that is business spending. Pretty much any money they spend on anything, whether it's a pen or a huge machine or a huge factory, is investment spending, and that obviously contributes to demand in our economy. Government spending, reminder that that is not including benefits, that is government spending on goods and services. So when they pay for a new building at the school, or they pay my salary, or they pay for the work on the motorways, that's all part of government spending. And finally, X minus M, which is known as net exports, the difference between spending on imports and what we get from our exports. On the whole, that's usually slightly negative. We usually spend a bit more on imports than we do on exports, than we earn on exports. But at the moment, it's about balanced. That's in 2016. So the aggregate demand curve shows the overall level of spending at different price levels. It's downward sloping as usual for a demand curve. We're not going to look too closely at why that is. You can have a look at this PowerPoint if you want to know, but it's not something that comes up in NCEA. So as you should hopefully know by now, price level is always on the vertical axis. Remembering it's measured by the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So on average, what's the level of prices? And on the bottom axis is real GDP or real national income or real output. They all mean the same thing. How much stuff are we making? Okay, and we use the symbol Y for that, which stands for national income. So here's our aggregate demand curve, often drawn just as a straight line, up to you. P1, Y1 at the price level P1 or PL1, I tend to use PL1 myself. Aggregate demand curve would give a level of output of Y1. That's how much would be demanded by all those sectors, consumers, producers, government, and the overseas sector at that price level. Okay, and that will be tied to a certain level of unemployment. Obviously, the more we produce, the lower our unemployment rate. So we want to move along the national income line, if you like, as far as we can, because it will get us the lowest level of unemployment. If prices rise, that's likely to lead to a fall in aggregate demand. That's probably not a real surprise, assuming people's incomes stay the same. We just can't afford to buy as much. There are other effects as well. And again, at lower levels of national income, we have higher levels of unemployment. So what's going to shift the aggregate demand curve? So anything that's going to affect consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, or net exports will affect the aggregate demand curve. So when I'm doing aggregate demand, aggregate supply sort of analysis, and you get something that's changed, the first thing I think is it going to affect C, I, G, X, or M? If it does, then it's going to shift aggregate demand. So for example, increasing income tax would affect consumption. It would actually do the opposite of what's been shown here. It would decrease aggregate demand. So any other factor, like for example, if our exports are doing particularly well, is going to increase aggregate demand. So you do need to be familiar with what's going to shift each of those factors. If aggregate demand shifts out, then national output's going to increase, and so national income is going to increase and unemployment will fall. So there's a stack of factors that will affect each component of that. I'm not going to go through them all. The big one with consumer spending is income levels. If income levels increase, then obviously people will spend more. The other key one probably is interest rates. Interest rates, a lot of adults have debt. If interest rates go up, they have to pay more to the banks on their debt, and therefore they have less money to spend on other things. So interest rates are really important at the moment. This is in July 2016. Interest rates are at an all-time low. So that's encouraging people to spend. It's a good time to borrow. A good time to borrow for spending, because you're paying maybe 4 or 5% interest, which is very low by New Zealand standards. Wealth comes in as well. If people are feeling wealthy, they spend more because they feel like if things go bad, they can just sell off the things they own. So property prices in particular are important for that. If property prices are rising quickly, then the people with the property are feeling pretty confident about where they're at. Investment spending is important. It's business spending. As you know, any spending on any spending on investment. Probably the key thing, business confidence is important, how businesses think they're going to go in the future. But also interest rates again come up, because in most cases businesses borrow in order to buy their capital goods. If interest rates are high, that makes it less profitable to buy that new machinery or build that new building. If interest rates are low, again, then the costs are going to be low of borrowing, and that's going to encourage businesses to spend on their business. Government spending, we know that health, education and social welfare are the big areas of spending, but remember we kind of ignore social welfare for this because we're talking about buying goods and services. So government spending is really up to the government. If they increase government spending, it'll increase aggregate demand. So if they are boosting the amount being spent on roads and building houses, state houses, that will increase government spending. Import spending will depend on what's going on with overseas. So this is really important. What's happening in New Zealand has no effect. No, I'll take that back. Sorry, I got that around the wrong way. Import spending, it depends on what income's like in New Zealand. If New Zealand's doing well, if our incomes are going up, we buy more imports. Simple as that, really. And that's an outflow of funds out of the country. Export earnings have nothing to do with what's happening in New Zealand. It depends on what's happening overseas. We want Australia, China, the US, Europe to be doing well, because then they'll buy more of our stuff. Okay, so buying more of our stuff adds to aggregate demand. Right, so on to aggregate supply. So that's aggregate demand. So anything that will shift A, C, I, G, X, or M will affect our aggregate demand. Aggregate supply is different. It is what firms are prepared to produce at different prices, so very similar to your standard supply curve. So the big things that are going to affect that are your costs of production and technology. There are other things as well. Productivity is important, and we'll come back to that in a sec. So aggregate supply looks like this. Note its shape. It's flat at low levels of output and becomes increasingly steep. Notice we've got this thing called YF, full employment. So that's the limit of what the economy can produce. And notice the aggregate supply curve goes basically vertical when we reach that level. Okay, so at output level Y1, the economy is working below full capacity and there's going to be unemployment. The gap between Y1 and YF represents how much unemployment there is. As I said before, we want to be pretty close to full employment so that most people have got a job. Do be aware that full employment means not just full employment of people, but full employment of our capital resources as well. So our factories are working flat out if we're on YF. As you can see, aggregate supply gets steeper and steeper as we get close to full employment. That's what we call overheating. We're lacking resources at that point. We're having problems getting more resources. That pushes prices and costs up, and so the aggregate supply curve gets steeper and steeper. Basically, firms are going to want higher and higher prices because their costs are going to be going up as they struggle to get resources. Okay, so again, increases in capacity can occur which will shift the aggregate supply curve. It's kind of like shifting the production possibility frontier out, so it shifts like that. We don't typically deal with YF shifting out in NCEA, so you can kind of ignore that. But if something happens to increase the amount we can produce as a country, then aggregate supply will shift out and so will YF. So putting them together will give us our equilibrium for the economy, and that will give us the price level and output level we're producing at. So this graph here has got a recessionary gap. What that means is that employment at Y1 is less than full employment at YF. Obviously we would like to reduce that because that's going to be a problem for our economy, and it certainly doesn't meet our goal of full employment and economic growth. What we want to do is increase aggregate demand, or alternatively increase aggregate supply. So a shift in the aggregate demand curve to 81 because C, I, G or X have increased will increase growth and reduce unemployment because the gap between Y2 and YF is smaller. But at a cost, as you can see, price level is increased, and that's inflation. And we'll come back to that later, but the goal for inflation is that we have prices rising no faster than 3% and no slower than 1%. Alright, if we keep increasing aggregate demand, that's okay, we'll be reducing unemployment, but it will cause more inflation because of the slope of the aggregate supply curve. So we have to be careful about getting too close to full employment unless the economy can keep expanding. So as you can see here, we've got inflation going up higher and higher for a smaller increase in YF and national output. It's actually ideally, if we can get aggregate supply increasing as well, that's actually ideal growth. If aggregate supply can increase, then it keeps prices under control. So it's things like reducing costs and in particular increasing productivity. Productivity makes businesses able to grow without needing to put their prices up because they're getting more out of their resources. So the government can do things around that, like improving how well our infrastructure works, roads and things like that. Okay, and that's us for now. Make sure you know the key thing is to understand the difference between the things that affect aggregate demand and aggregate supply.